U.S. Marine jokingly asked for the old man's rank, until his reply made the entire GP tent silent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get to the story. The sun blazed down on the sprawling military camp, the intense heat mixing with the sharp scent of freshly cut grass. Inside the general-purpose tent, a group of young Marines were gathered, their voices low but full of the bravado that came from youth and inexperience. In the back of the tent, an old man sat quietly, observing the chaos unfolding around him. His name was John Miller, a man whose life had been defined by quiet sacrifice and unsung heroism. But to these Marines, he was just another old man, a relic of a bygone era, a man whose days of relevance were long behind him. One young Marine, barely old enough to shave, turned to him with a smirk on his face. "Hey, old man, what's your rank?" The words were sharp, a jab thrown for no reason other than to mock. John Miller didn't flinch. He didn't even look up immediately. His hands, worn from years of hard work, rested in his lap, and his eyes stayed fixed on the men around him, his face as unreadable as the stone monuments that dotted the camp. The Marine pressed on, his voice dripping with mockery. "I'm talking to you, Grandpa. What's your rank?" There was a slight shift in the old man's posture, but still, he said nothing. The tense atmosphere thickened, the tension palpable, as the younger man took a step forward, clearly expecting a reaction. "Come on, old-timer, you're still in the military, right?" He laughed, his words cutting through the air. But John Miller, calm as ever, finally lifted his eyes and met the Marine's gaze. His voice was quiet, but it carried an unspoken weight that made the young man pause. "My rank doesn't matter anymore." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a freight train. The tent fell into silence. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. The young Marine, expecting the old man to cower, instead found himself caught in the weight of the man's words. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. It wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't the response he had wanted. He stood there for a moment, blinking, before shaking his head in disbelief. "Yeah, sure, whatever," he muttered, turning to walk away. But the damage had been done. John Miller's calmness, his quiet defiance, had made a ripple in the room. No one laughed. No one mocked. The weight of his silence had made everyone pause, even if just for a moment. Outside the tent, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the distance. But inside, the young Marine was still processing the gravity of the old man's response. The question had been a joke, but the answer? It wasn't a joke. It was a statement. And it made everyone stop, if only for a second, to wonder just who this old man really was. The tension in the room hung heavy after John Miller's response. The young Marine, still caught off guard by the old man's words, shifted uncomfortably. He looked around the tent, hoping for some sort of reaction from his peers, but instead found only silence. His confidence wavered, and he awkwardly scratched the back of his neck. But no one spoke. No one laughed. The weight of John Miller's calm, collected response had landed like a punch no one saw coming. The younger man, unwilling to admit his discomfort, let out a small chuckle. "Yeah, whatever, old man," he muttered, walking away and rejoining his buddies who were all still whispering to each other. But the atmosphere in the tent had changed. It wasn't just the Marine. It was everyone. A quiet ripple had moved through the group. Even the other Marines, who had been eyeing Miller with barely concealed disdain, now hesitated. Some shifted their gaze to the old man in the corner, as if searching for something in his face that had been absent before. For a moment, John Miller became a figure of quiet authority, his presence more powerful than the uniformed Marines that surrounded him. As the seconds ticked by, the air in the tent felt thick, as if everyone knew something was about to shift. And then, as if on cue, the sound of heavy boots echoed outside the tent. It wasn't the usual shuffle of the younger Marines or their commanding officers. These footsteps were sharp, deliberate, and carried with them an undeniable weight. John Miller remained seated, his hands resting on his lap, his face an unreadable mask. But inside, His heart began to race. He knew what this meant. The Marines inside the tent had no idea, but he did. He had been in this position before. This wasn't the first time he had been underestimated. It wasn't the first time someone had mocked him, but it would be the last. The tent flap was pulled back, and in walked a man who commanded immediate respect. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a hard edge to his posture, the officer's presence filled the room. His uniform was impeccable, his every movement precise. The Marines in the tent immediately snapped to attention, their shoulders stiffening as the new arrival's gaze swept across the room. At ease, the officer barked, and without missing a beat, he locked eyes with John Miller. There was no recognition in the younger man's face, no surprise, no immediate understanding. But there was something else, a tension in the way his gaze lingered on Miller. The officer took a deliberate step forward, his boots clicking loudly against the hard ground. "What's this?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of authority. "You've got a room full of Marines, and yet we're wasting time?" Miller didn't stand. He didn't have to. His presence spoke for him. The officer continued to study him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. "Who are you, soldier?" the officer demanded. John Miller didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, his piercing eyes locking with the officer's. "I'm just a man who's been around long enough to know when it's time to speak and when it's time to stay silent." The officer, for the first time, looked confused. He had expected a response, something more fitting for a man who was clearly out of place in this setting. But the words John Miller spoke carried weight, and they stopped the officer in his tracks. The young Marines watched, a mix of curiosity and unease in their eyes. They had expected something different from the old man. A plea for respect, a cowering apology. Instead, they had gotten silence. And silence was a form of power all on its own. The officer's expression shifted from one of confusion to realization. He stepped back, his sharp gaze still fixed on Miller. "You've been through more than any of us," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The room felt quieter than it had before. The young Marine who had mocked Miller earlier shifted uncomfortably, his bravado all but gone. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to be felt in every breath. The officer hesitated for a moment longer, then turned to the rest of the group, his voice now commanding and full of authority. "I should have known," he said, his tone changing. "This man is a legend." There was a moment of silence, as if the words were still sinking in. "A man who has earned respect not from words, but from actions," the officer continued, his gaze sweeping over the tent, meeting the eyes of each Marine one by one. The younger soldiers shifted uncomfortably. They had no idea who John Miller was, but in that moment, they knew they had underestimated him. And underestimating him was a mistake they wouldn't make again. The officer's words echoed in the silence of the tent, and the air seemed to shift, thickening with the weight of his statement. John Miller remained seated, his expression unchanged. The officer's voice cut through the tension once more, this time with an added sense of respect. "This man isn't just some old veteran, not someone you can casually mock. He's earned every stripe, every word of respect he's ever gotten." The younger Marines stood frozen, their eyes flicking nervously between Miller and the officer. The atmosphere was no longer one of ridicule, but of quiet reverence. The officer, now standing tall, took a step forward and addressed the group. "Do any of you know who this man is?" he asked, his gaze scanning the young soldiers, none of whom dared to answer. A few looked down at the ground, some still processing the revelation, while others were too embarrassed to meet Miller's eyes. The officer didn't wait for an answer. "Let me tell you who he is," he continued. "This is Sergeant Major John Miller, a man who saved an entire battalion under enemy fire during the Gulf War, a man who took a bullet for a fellow soldier and kept fighting." He paused, letting the words settle. "And he's not done yet." The shock in the tent was palpable. The Marines, who had once seen him as nothing more than an old man sitting quietly in the back of the room, now looked at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. Miller had remained silent, not because he was hiding anything, but because he had nothing to prove. His life had already been written in the actions he had taken, not in the words he had spoken. "You see," the officer continued, his tone softening, "when you've been through what he has, when you've been in the heat of battle, nothing else really matters. You learn to respect the silence, the moments when speaking isn't needed. The Marines now stood a little straighter, their previous bravado slipping away as they finally realized the magnitude of the situation. It wasn't just about rank or call signs. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be measured by medals or titles. Miller's legacy was written in the lives he had saved, the men who would never forget his courage. Sergeant Major Miller, the officer said, turning to him now with a more personal tone, I apologize for my men's behavior. They didn't know who they were dealing with. For the first time since the officer entered the tent, Miller stood. Slowly, with a grace that belied his years, he faced the officer. It's all right, Miller replied, his voice steady, calm. They didn't know, but now they do. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that none of the young Marines would ever forget. The officer nodded, understanding that this moment, this quiet exchange, would be more impactful than any reprimand or lecture. You're a true hero, the officer said, his voice thick with respect. You deserve more than this, he motioned around the tent, more than what they gave you today. But Miller just shook his head. I don't need anything, he said quietly. I've already had my share of recognition. This is about them now. They're the ones who need to understand. The officer looked at the young Marines, who now stood in silence, the reality of the situation settling in. You'll never find a man more deserving of respect than this one, the officer said, his gaze sweeping over the group. He's earned it not just with his rank, but with his actions. Remember that. The tent remained quiet as the officer's words sank in. It wasn't just about Miller. It was about understanding the value of those who came before them, those who had laid the foundation for the very world they lived in. As the officer turned to leave, he paused for a moment, looking back at Miller. Sergeant Major, you have my respect, he said with a sharp salute. Miller nodded, returning the salute with a calmness that spoke volumes. Thank you, he replied. With that, the officer left the tent, and the young Marine stood there for a long moment, processing the weight of what had just happened. They would never forget the man who had sat in silence, the man who had been more than just a veteran. He was a legend, and now they knew it. As the tent grew silent after the officer's departure, the young Marines stood frozen in place, their minds still trying to process the weight of the moment. They had heard the words, but their full meaning hadn't sunk in yet. For so long, they had seen John Miller as nothing more than an old man, someone whose time had long passed, but now, they understood. His quiet demeanor, his steady gaze, and his unwavering confidence had shown them a side of the military they had never truly appreciated. The reality of his history was something none of them could fully grasp, not in just a few moments. But they knew one thing for sure. They would never look at him the same way again. Slowly, one by one, the young Marines began to lower their postures. No one dared speak. The weight of their newfound respect for Miller had left them speechless. They had all been on the receiving end of a harsh lesson in humility. John Miller, a man who had given everything for his country, had remained silent when mocked. But in that silence, he had revealed more about honor and strength than any of them could have imagined. After what felt like an eternity, a young lance corporal broke the silence. His voice was hesitant, but the sincerity in it was clear. Sergeant Major, I'm sorry. We didn't know. John Miller turned his head slightly, his eyes softening. He gave a small nod, as if to say there was no need for apologies. The lance corporal stood a little straighter, his gaze now focused on the old man with newfound respect. It was then that the young Marine in the back of the tent, the one who had mocked Miller earlier, stepped forward. He hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Sergeant Major, he began, his voice quiet but steady. I didn't mean to disrespect you. Miller met his eyes, but didn't speak. The young Marine took a deep breath before continuing, his words filled with regret. I've heard the stories now, about what you've done, about who you really are. I'm sorry for being a fool. The air was thick with emotion as the room waited for Miller's response. He didn't rush to speak. Instead, he took a long moment, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he spoke, his voice calm but powerful. You're not the first to make that mistake, he said. And you won't be the last. But that's all right. We all have our moments of foolishness. It's how we learn from them that counts. The young Marine nodded, visibly relieved. But Miller wasn't done. What matters now, he continued, is how you carry yourselves from here on out. You've got the rest of your lives ahead of you. Make it count. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, the young Marines found themselves thinking beyond their immediate future, beyond the routine of drills and operations. They began to realize that their purpose in the military, and perhaps in life, wasn't just about earning medals or titles. It was about something far deeper, something that John Miller had known all along. As the silence settled over the tent, the young Marines exchanged glances. They no longer saw Miller as just an old man. They saw him for what he truly was, a living legend, a man who had fought battles not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when strength was shown in silence. John Miller had shown them a new way to look at service, at honor, and at respect. He had earned it not with his rank, but with his actions. And now, the Marines knew that it was their turn to prove themselves worthy of the legacy he had left behind. The following morning, the military camp was bustling with activity, but the events of the previous day hung heavily in the air. John Miller had become more than just an old veteran in the eyes of the young Marines. He had become a symbol, a reminder that there was much more to service than the accolades, the medals, or the rank. The tent, which had once been filled with arrogance and laughter, now felt empty without him. The Marines, who had once seen him as a relic of the past, were now filled with respect, admiration, and a sense of quiet awe. They had all learned something that they hadn't expected. The lessons they had received from the old man were not about combat tactics or military drills. They were about honor, respect, and the true meaning of duty. But Miller's impact went beyond just that one encounter. The next few days, as the Marines went about their training, something had changed within them. They worked harder, with more focus, with more attention to detail. The jokes and laughter that had once filled the barracks had been replaced by a quiet intensity, as if each of them was reflecting on what they had learned. They had learned to never underestimate someone, no matter their age or appearance. They had learned that respect had to be earned, but it was also something that could be lost in an instant. And they had learned that sometimes, silence was the loudest form of strength. Miller had become a legend, not just because of his past, but because of the way he carried himself, the way he had handled the disrespect without retaliation, the way he had shown them what true strength looked like. As the days passed, one particular Marine, Corporal Jennings, found himself reflecting on the encounter more than the others. He was the one who had mocked Miller the most, the one who had initially shown the most disdain. And now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. He had been so eager to fit in, to prove himself in front of his peers, that he had failed to recognize the real strength standing before him. Jennings wasn't one to admit fault easily, but he knew, deep down, that his behavior had been wrong. He had seen what happened when the officer entered the tent, how the entire room had snapped to attention, how the Marines who had once laughed at Miller were now filled with respect. He had seen the look in Miller's eyes, a calmness that spoke of experience, of wisdom, and of a man who had earned his place in the world without needing to prove anything to anyone. It gnawed at him. Jennings made up his mind. The next morning, when Miller appeared for breakfast, Jennings approached him. Miller was sitting at the far end of the mess hall, his usual quiet self, his eyes scanning the room as he slowly ate his meal. Jennings took a deep breath and walked over to him. As he approached, he felt his heart race. This was something he had never done before. He was about to apologize. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice unsteady, but sincere. "I owe you an apology for how I treated you the other day. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for disrespecting you." Miller didn't look up immediately. He simply continued eating, taking his time, as if letting the words settle. After a long pause, he finally met Jennings' gaze. "You don't need to apologize," Miller said quietly, his voice calm and steady. "You were just doing what you thought was right. But now you know better. And that's all that matters." Jennings stood there for a moment, the weight of Miller's words sinking in. He had expected something more, maybe anger, maybe harsh words. But Miller had given him understanding. "Thank you," Jennings said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for showing me what it means to be a real soldier." Miller gave a small nod, his face unreadable as always. "You'll learn," he said. "We all do eventually. Just remember that the true measure of a man is not in the medals he wears, but in the actions he takes when no one's looking." Jennings stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. But Miller's calm presence made him realize that sometimes there were no words needed. He gave a quick salute and walked away, his mind racing with everything he had learned in the past few days. As he rejoined his fellow Marines, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Pride not in himself, but in the lessons he had learned. He was no longer just a Marine. He was a part of something bigger, something that went beyond the uniform. He was a part of a legacy that had been passed down to him by men like John Miller. The days following the encounter in the mess hall were filled with a quiet transformation. John Miller, once seen as just an old veteran, had become something much more. He wasn't just a man who had survived battles. He was a living embodiment of what it meant to serve, to endure, and to respect. The Marines who had once mocked him now looked at him differently. Their interactions with him were no longer filled with casual mockery or dismissal. They were filled with respect, even awe. As the days went by, the young Marines began to approach their training with a new sense of purpose. The jokes had stopped, the taunts faded, and in their place, a focused intensity took root. They began to realize that it wasn't the rank that mattered, but the man beneath it, the character, the integrity, the experiences that shaped him. Corporal Jennings, who had once been the loudest in his mockery, now found himself seeking out Miller for advice. It wasn't that Miller had offered grand speeches or lessons. No, it was something much subtler. It was the way Miller carried himself, the way he moved through the camp, always steady, always calm. Jennings had never seen someone so composed, someone who seemed to be in control of everything, not because he shouted orders or made demands, but because he simply was. The older Marine's quiet strength was contagious. One afternoon, while the Marines were gathered in the briefing room, Jennings found himself sitting next to Miller. It had become a regular occurrence. Miller, the silent observer, and Jennings, the eager student. "Sergeant Major," Jennings said quietly, his voice laced with a newfound respect. "How did you do it? How did you stay calm, even when everyone else was losing their heads?" Miller, who had been silently watching a group of young Marines practice drills outside the window, turned his gaze toward him. He didn't speak immediately, as if weighing the question carefully. Finally, he answered, "It's not about staying calm, son. It's about knowing that the moment you lose control, you lose everything." He paused, letting his words settle in. In combat, in life, you've got to keep your head. When everything around you is chaos, your calmness becomes your greatest weapon. That's what gets you through. That's what gets everyone around you through. Jennings nodded, taking in the gravity of his words. He had seen it in Miller's actions. The man never raised his voice, never showed panic. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded respect. It wasn't the medals or the history that made Miller who he was. It was his ability to remain grounded, to not be swept away by the whirlwind around him. As the weeks passed, Miller continued to teach without words. The Marines who had once avoided him now sought him out. They asked him questions, listened to his stories, and began to see the value in his experience. It was clear that Miller wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a bridge to something deeper, something more meaningful. One day, as the camp was preparing for an upcoming exercise, Miller was sitting on a bench outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. Jennings, now a frequent companion, sat down beside him, feeling a sense of quiet reverence. "Sergeant Major," Jennings began, "I've been thinking about what you said, about keeping control. But what do you do when it feels like everything is out of control? What if you're not sure you can keep it together?" Miller turned his gaze toward him, his eyes softening. "Son," he said, his voice steady and calm, "it's okay to feel that way. It's okay to doubt yourself. But you can't let that doubt control you. You've got to push through it. Trust your training. Trust the men around you. And trust yourself. When you believe in your ability to make it through, others will believe in you too." Jennings absorbed every word. He had heard similar things before, but somehow, Miller's words carried more weight. It wasn't just advice. It was wisdom earned through a lifetime of service. As they sat together in silence, the sounds of the camp continued around them. The clatter of boots on the ground, the sharp commands of officers, the rustle of training gear. But in that moment, all of it seemed distant. There was peace in the quiet wisdom that Miller offered. Jennings had never felt more certain of his path, more sure of his place in the world. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but with the lessons Miller had imparted, he felt ready to face whatever came next. And it wasn't just Jennings. As the rest of the young Marines began to follow Miller's example, the entire camp began to change. The atmosphere was different now, more focused, more respectful. The men had learned to see beyond the uniform, to understand that true strength came from within. It wasn't just about being a Marine. It was about being a man of honor, a man who could remain steady, no matter the storm around him. And John Miller, the quiet old man who had once been overlooked, had become the living embodiment of that lesson. His legacy wasn't just in the past he carried with him. It was in the Marines who had learned from him, who would carry his wisdom with them as they moved forward in their own service. And in that way, his story was far from over. The weeks went by, and the transformation at the camp was undeniable. John Miller, the quiet, unassuming man who had once been the subject of mockery, had now become the cornerstone of a culture shift within the unit. The Marines who had once snickered behind his back now sought him out for advice. They wanted to hear his stories, to understand the lessons that had been hard-earned in the heat of battle. It wasn't just the young Marines who had changed. The officers, too, had begun to recognize the value Miller brought to the camp. His wisdom, earned through years of service, became something the command staff couldn't ignore. The respect for him grew, not just from his peers but from those in charge. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Captain Davis, the officer who had first brought Miller's history to light, found himself reflecting on the man's impact. He had been the first to understand the depth of Miller's experience, and it had changed how he viewed leadership. Leadership wasn't about shouting orders or commanding from a distance. It was about earning respect, not through rank, but through the actions you took and the way you treated those under your command. Captain Davis had been so focused on authority and control when he first entered the unit. But now, after observing Miller and the way the old man commanded respect without ever raising his voice, Davis was starting to rethink his approach. He found himself walking toward the small bench where Miller was sitting, just as he had on the days when the young Marines had first begun to realize who he was. The older man's gaze was once again fixed on the horizon, his hands folded in his lap, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. Davis cleared his throat before speaking, unsure of how to approach the man he now saw as a mentor. "Sergeant Major," he began, "I've been thinking about what you've taught us. I didn't get it at first. I thought leadership was about power, about showing who's in charge. But now I see what you mean. It's about respect. Real respect. Not the kind you earn through rank, but through what you do and how you live." Miller didn't look at him immediately. He took his time, allowing the silence to settle between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You're learning," he said softly. "And that's what matters. It's not about being the loudest in the room. It's about knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to remain silent. And you have to lead by example. People don't follow orders. They follow those they trust." Davis nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Miller's words. The quiet man had taught him more in a few sentences than any military manual ever could. Leadership wasn't about forcing people to follow. It was about earning that trust, that respect, and letting your actions speak for themselves. As the evening grew darker, Davis took a seat beside Miller, both men staring out at the camp. The sounds of evening drills faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the camp settling in for the night. "You know," Davis said after a while, "I used to think being in charge meant being the one with all the answers. But now, I realize it's more about being the one who can ask the right questions." Miller gave a slight chuckle, his first real smile in days. "You're getting there, Captain. You'll get there." The words were simple, but they were exactly what Davis needed to hear. The transformation that had begun with the younger Marines now spread to the officers as well. They had all started to see the value in Miller's quiet strength, his unwavering composure in the face of adversity. And it wasn't just the Marines who were changing. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. There was a new sense of unity, of respect, not just for Miller, but for one another. The young Marines who had once mocked their elders now took time to listen to them, to learn from their experience. The officers who had once been focused solely on strategy now took a moment to appreciate the human element of leadership. And in the center of it all, John Miller remained the same, steady, quiet, and ever watchful. He had given them all a gift, one that none of them would forget. It wasn't just about fighting on the battlefield. It was about fighting the battles within, learning when to speak and when to listen, and knowing that sometimes the greatest strength lay in silence. As the weeks wore on, the camp had become a different place. It was no longer the noisy, brash environment where every Marine fought to outdo the other in jokes and mockery. Now, there was a quiet seriousness to the way the Marines carried themselves. They worked with precision, with respect, and with a newfound understanding that it wasn't just about surviving the drills or the daily grind. It was about something deeper, a sense of duty, respect, and honor that transcended any immediate task at hand. John Miller had done more than just teach them about military tactics. He had shown them what true strength looked like, how a man could stand tall without a single word of boast, simply because his actions spoke louder than anything he could ever say. The young Marines, once dismissive, now sought him out regularly. They asked him about his experiences, listened intently to his stories, and slowly began to internalize the values that had shaped his life. They learned that leadership didn't come from the loudest voice in the room, but from the one who stayed calm when everything else was falling apart. Corporal Jennings, who had been one of the most vocal in his mockery, had transformed the most. He'd gone from being one of the biggest skeptics to being one of Miller's most trusted admirers. His approach to everything had changed. No longer driven by arrogance or bravado, Jennings now led by example. He didn't try to command attention with loud remarks or flashy displays of strength. Instead, he worked quietly, steadily, and his peers had taken notice. One afternoon, as the Marines finished up a grueling training exercise, Jennings found himself alone in the barracks with Miller. The camp had quieted for a rare moment of peace, the hum of the bass replaced by the soft rustling of papers and the occasional clink of gear being cleaned. Jennings, who had spent weeks reflecting on Miller's lessons, approached the older man, who sat casually on a bench, his hands folded, gazing out at the horizon. "Sergeant Major," Jennings began, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've taught us. About staying calm, about how to lead." Miller didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded for Jennings to continue. "It's not easy," Jennings admitted. "Not when the pressure is on, when everyone around you is losing their cool. I've realized it's not about being perfect, but about staying true to what you've learned, even when everything is falling apart." Miller finally looked over at him, his eyes warm, as if he understood exactly what Jennings was going through. "You're right," Miller said quietly. "Leadership doesn't mean being perfect. It means showing up every day, doing your best, and being there for your team. It means knowing that they can rely on you when things get tough, and that you'll never give up on them." Jennings stood a little straighter, the weight of Miller's words hitting him harder than any drill or order ever had. "I didn't get it at first," he said, his voice still tinged with humility. "But now I do. I get it." Miller gave a small smile, one that spoke volumes. "Good," he said simply. "It's all about the little things. The moments no one sees. They matter more than anything else." As the sun set, casting a warm orange glow across the camp, the two men sat in silence, the quiet a reflection of the calm that had taken root in the hearts of the Marines. Miller had become more than just a mentor to them. He had become a living symbol of everything they aspired to be. It wasn't just about physical strength or combat skills. It was about being the kind of person who could endure anything and still remain steady. The days passed, and as the Marines continued their training, they found themselves not only becoming better soldiers, but becoming better men. They had learned that strength didn't lie in how loud they could shout or how fast they could run. It lay in their ability to stand firm in the face of adversity, to maintain composure when everything else seemed to be unraveling. Miller had given them that strength, had shown them the way. As the training exercises grew more intense and the pressure mounted, the Marines faced challenges that tested them not just physically, but mentally. But through it all, they carried with them the lessons they had learned from Miller. And when they faltered, when the weight of the world seemed too heavy to bear, they knew they could always rely on the quiet strength that had been instilled in them. John Miller may have been an old man, but his influence would echo through their lives for years to come. They knew that the true test of a Marine was not just how they fought, but how they led, how they carried the honor of their brothers and sisters in arms with dignity, and how they remained calm in the face of chaos. And in this, Miller had given them everything they needed to succeed. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere at the camp continued to change. The transformation was subtle at first, but soon enough, it became impossible to ignore. The young Marines who had once thought of themselves as the toughest around began to realize that true strength wasn't about outmuscling each other or getting the highest score in a drill. It was about something deeper, something they could only fully understand now. After witnessing the example set by John Miller, the discipline within the ranks had sharpened, but so had the respect. They treated each other differently now, with a level of camaraderie that hadn't existed before. The arrogance that once colored their conversations had been replaced by a more grounded humility. They were still Marines, still warriors, but they were learning to be better men in the process. Miller, however, never changed. He continued to stay on the sidelines, watching, observing, offering the occasional word of wisdom when necessary, but mostly letting the Marines learn through their own experience. They had all come to realize that he wasn't just a symbol of their past. He was a guide for their future. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, Miller sat outside the mess hall, his ever-present silence filling the space around him. A few of the Marines had gathered around, sitting at a table nearby, but no one dared disturb him. It wasn't out of fear, but out of respect. They all knew that when Miller spoke, it was important. When he remained silent, there was a reason for it. Corporal Jennings, who had spent the last several weeks trying to apply the lessons he had learned from Miller, stood up and walked over to where he sat. There was a look of determination in his eyes now, no longer the uncertainty that had once marked his actions. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking about everything you've taught us. About leading by example, staying calm when everything is chaos. But there's one thing I can't seem to understand." Miller turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Jennings's. He didn't say anything, but the slight nod he gave indicated he was listening. Jennings took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "How do you keep going? After everything you've been through, after all the battles, the losses, how do you keep moving forward without ever losing that sense of purpose?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any drill they had ever endured. Miller didn't answer right away. He sat quietly for a moment, his eyes focusing on the horizon, as though he were seeing something far beyond the camp. Finally, his voice broke the silence, calm and measured, the words laced with years of experience. "You keep going because you don't have a choice. There's always something that needs to be done, someone who needs you. You do it not for recognition, not for the medals, but because that's your duty." Jennings nodded, absorbing the words. He had expected some grand philosophical explanation, but the simplicity of Miller's response was what struck him the most. It wasn't about finding meaning in every battle or seeking out glory. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter how tough it got. "And the losses?" Jennings asked quietly. "How do you deal with those?" Miller's eyes softened as he looked at the young Marine. "You don't. You carry them with you. You don't forget, and you don't try to bury it. But you keep moving forward, because the moment you stop is the moment you let the past define you." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Jennings felt a sense of clarity. He had been searching for some way to make sense of everything, for some deep, profound reason to keep pushing forward when everything seemed lost. But Miller's answer was so simple, so grounded, that it made everything else fall into place. Life wasn't about erasing the bad, about forgetting the losses. It was about accepting them, learning from them, and still choosing to move forward. That was the real test of a Marine, the real test of a person. The night grew colder, and the camp started to settle into a quiet rhythm, but Jennings remained by Miller's side, taking in everything he had learned. He had been wrong to think that leadership was about being the strongest or the loudest. Leadership was about resilience. It was about showing up, day after day, and doing what was needed. It was about standing tall, no matter the weight of the world on your shoulders. As the days continued to pass, the Marines were tested in ways they hadn't been before. Their strength, their courage, and their resolve were pushed to the limit. But with every challenge they faced, they grew stronger, not because they were simply following orders, but because they had learned to lead themselves. And it was all thanks to the example set by one quiet man. John Miller had shown them that true strength wasn't just about physical power or rank. It was about what you carried within, the quiet confidence that came from knowing you had earned the respect of those around you. Miller had given them the tools to be more than just soldiers. He had given them the tools to be better people. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that would live on long after the drills ended and the uniforms were put away. As time passed, the changes within the camp became more evident. The Marines who had once looked down on John Miller for his age and quiet demeanor were now filled with a sense of reverence whenever he walked by. The respect they had for him was not born from his rank, but from the way he had quietly shaped them into something better. They had all learned that leadership wasn't about loud commands or intimidating displays of power. It was about integrity, reliability, and the ability to inspire respect without saying a word. Corporal Jennings, who had been one of the biggest skeptics, found himself reflecting more on the lessons he had learned from Miller. He had grown from a young Marine eager to prove his strength into someone who understood that true strength came from within. He had seen it firsthand in Miller, someone who didn't need to flaunt his abilities, someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. He had learned that sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was stay calm in the face of chaos, to lead by example rather than force others to follow. One afternoon, as the Marines prepared for a new set of drills, Captain Davis called them all together for an important announcement. The command staff had noticed the change in the unit's morale and performance, and they wanted to acknowledge it. They had observed the transformation, the respect the Marines now showed one another, and the new sense of purpose that had taken root within the ranks. "We've seen the difference," Captain Davis said, standing before the gathered Marines. "And it's not just about how well you're doing in the field. It's about how you treat each other, the way you work as a team, and most importantly, the way you carry yourselves, whether you're in combat or off-duty. You've all learned a great deal, and I think it's time to acknowledge the man who has led by example, Sergeant Major John Miller." There was a brief moment of silence before the entire unit broke into applause. Miller, as usual, remained seated quietly off to the side, watching with a soft smile. He hadn't asked for recognition, but the respect was undeniable. He had never sought it, and yet, in his own way, he had earned it more than anyone else in the room. "Sergeant Major Miller," Captain Davis continued, "your quiet leadership, your strength, and your wisdom have made this unit stronger than ever. We thank you for that." Miller stood, nodding with a humble grace. He hadn't expected any of this. He never sought accolades, never cared for public recognition. But in that moment, the Marines who had once overlooked him saw him for who he truly was, not just a veteran with a storied past, but a man who had given everything for his country and for those around him. After the ceremony, as the Marines began to disperse, Jennings made his way over to Miller, his eyes filled with newfound admiration. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice steady but full of respect, "I've been thinking about what you said, about staying calm, about leading by example. But I don't think I fully understood it until now. You never asked for any of this recognition, did you?" Miller gave a small smile, the kind that had become familiar to those who knew him. "No, I didn't. But it's not about what I get. It's about what you all take away from it. That's what matters." Jennings nodded, a sense of understanding flooding him. "I think I finally get it," he said quietly. "It's not the medals or the awards. It's about the people we become along the way." Miller's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on Jennings's shoulder. "Exactly. It's about who you are when no one's watching. That's what defines you." Jennings stood taller, the weight of Miller's words settling deep within him. For the first time, he understood what it truly meant to be a Marine. It wasn't just about being the best fighter, the fastest, or the strongest. It was about being the person who others could rely on, the one who led with integrity and treated every person with respect. As the sun began to set over the camp, the last rays of light caught the faces of the Marines, who were finishing their drills and preparing for the evening. There was a new energy among them, a quiet strength, a sense of pride, and a bond that hadn't existed before. The lesson they had learned from John Miller was one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. He had given them more than just military skills. He had given them a sense of purpose, a sense of self, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve. The Marines had come to understand that true leadership wasn't about asserting dominance or seeking recognition. It was about being there for your team, being steady in the storm, and leading with character and respect. And in that way, Sergeant Major John Miller had shaped them into something greater than they had ever imagined. He had shown them that strength wasn't just in what you did, but in who you were. The transformation within the unit had reached its peak, and the respect for John Miller had become something of a quiet legacy. It was clear now that he wasn't just another veteran sitting on the sidelines. He had become the foundation upon which these Marines built their understanding of what it meant to serve. What had once been a group of individuals vying for attention, fighting for their place, was now a cohesive unit that worked together with a level of respect that was palpable. The drills had become more efficient, the teamwork had improved, and the sense of purpose was stronger than ever before. But it wasn't just about the physical training. The real test came when they were called upon to prove themselves. It was during a mission that would truly show how far they had come. The unit was sent on a routine training exercise in a remote area, far from the safety of their camp. The mission was simple: navigate through a dense forest, set up a temporary camp, and then conduct an assault drill. But as they set up camp that night, something went wrong. The weather had turned unexpectedly, and the heavy rain and strong winds made the task nearly impossible. The Marines struggled to keep the camp intact, their tents flying away in the wind, gear getting soaked, and fires barely holding against the downpour. It was chaos, but amidst it all, the Marines were calm. They worked together, pulling together whatever they could to make sure their camp was functional, even in the worst conditions. Miller had watched them from a distance, his usual quiet observation giving way to a quiet pride. The young Marines had learned how to handle pressure, and they were proving it now. In the midst of the storm, Corporal Jennings, now one of the more experienced members of the team, took charge. He wasn't shouting orders or trying to take over the situation. He simply spoke with clarity and purpose, guiding the others with a steady hand. "Get the tarps set up over there," he said, pointing to a patch of dry ground. "We need to keep the gear off the mud." His words were short, but they carried weight, and the Marines responded without hesitation. He moved through the camp, ensuring that everyone had a task and that no one was left standing idly by. Jennings wasn't leading by force, but by example. He moved with purpose, and in his actions, the others followed. The chaos of the storm had become a test of their character, and Jennings had stepped up, just as Miller had shown them. Hours later, as the storm continued to rage, the camp was finally set up. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. The Marines sat around their makeshift campfire, the heat from the flames cutting through the cold night air. They were exhausted, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the air. They had faced the storm, and they had made it through together. They had proven that they were more than just a group of soldiers. They were a team. Miller, who had been standing at the edge of the camp, silently watching, now walked over to join them. His eyes were tired, but there was a glint of approval in them. He sat down beside Jennings, who had just finished checking the camp's perimeter. "You did good," Miller said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. Jennings nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. "We all did," he replied. "I couldn't have done it without them." Miller looked out at the Marines, each of them resting, recovering from the long night's work. "You've learned well," he said. "Leadership isn't about doing it all yourself. It's about knowing when to step up and when to step back, about trusting the men around you." Jennings looked around the campfire at his fellow Marines. He saw them not as individuals trying to outshine each other, but as a group working together to overcome a challenge. It was the kind of unity he had only imagined before. "I understand now," Jennings said softly. "It's about the team." Miller nodded. "Exactly. You lead by making everyone around you better, not by trying to be the best yourself. And when things get tough, when the storm hits, you'll see what you're really made of." The night passed, the storm eventually subsiding, leaving behind a quiet calm. The camp was still far from perfect, but the Marines had proved something that day. They had proved that they could endure, that they could lead, and that they could trust one another. It was a lesson that would stay with them forever. As the sun began to rise the next morning, casting a warm glow over the camp, the unit stood together, ready to continue their training. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a brotherhood, bound together by the lessons they had learned from one quiet man who had shown them the true meaning of leadership. And that lesson would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the Marines stood together, they had become something greater than the sum of their parts. The respect they now had for one another, for themselves, was unspoken but felt in everything they did. Their bond had grown strong, forged in the fires of challenge and adversity, and it was something they could never have imagined when they first arrived at the camp. John Miller had shown them that leadership wasn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It was about the quiet strength to carry on, no matter what. It was about being there when your team needed you most, and leading with humility and grace. It wasn't a lesson they had learned overnight, but with time, they had absorbed it, and now, they carried it with them every day. The camp felt different now. There was a new sense of unity, a quiet pride that had taken hold. Even the most experienced Marines, those who had been hardened by battle, now carried themselves with a new understanding of what it meant to lead. It wasn't about rank. It wasn't about titles. It was about being a man of integrity, a person who could be counted on when the situation was dire. As the days turned into weeks, the next challenge came, one that would put everything they had learned to the test. The camp had been notified of an upcoming live-fire exercise that would simulate real combat conditions. It was meant to be a test of not only their combat skills, but their ability to function as a unit under extreme stress. The tension was palpable. The young Marines, many of whom had never been in a live-fire situation, were nervous. They had trained hard, but there was always a sense of uncertainty when you stepped into a real-life scenario. And yet, as the day of the exercise arrived, there was something different in the air. The usual nervous chatter had been replaced by a focused intensity. They were ready. Miller, who had stood back and watched the transformation unfold, stood off to the side, observing as the Marines geared up. Jennings, now fully confident in his leadership, was speaking to his team, issuing calm, concise orders. "Keep your heads down, work together, and trust each other," he said, his voice steady. "Remember what we've learned. Stay calm, stay focused, and we'll get through this. We're a team." The Marines nodded, their faces set with determination. The exercise was about to begin, and as the first rounds were fired, the sound was deafening. The controlled chaos of the exercise began, with the Marines moving quickly, communicating, and reacting to the simulated enemy fire. For the first time, Jennings didn't feel the need to prove himself. He was leading without ego, relying on the skills they had all honed together. The experience of the exercise was brutal, but they got through it. The Marines had worked together as a unit, had relied on each other, and most importantly, had trusted one another. As the exercise came to an end, the sounds of gunfire faded, and the Marines regrouped. They were exhausted, covered in dirt, sweat, and the marks of battle, but they had done it. They had passed the test, not by outshining one another, but by supporting each other. Miller approached the group, his eyes scanning them, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer praise right away. He didn't need to. The Marines had proven themselves in the only way that mattered, through their actions. Jennings stepped forward, sweat running down his face, but a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We did it, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. Miller gave him a nod, his eyes filled with something akin to approval. "You did," he said softly. "You all did." The respect that had grown over the past weeks was now solidified. It wasn't just in the way they performed in the field, but in the way they carried themselves, in the way they supported one another. They had become a true team, bound together by trust, respect, and the lessons they had learned from Miller. As the sun began to set over the camp, casting a warm orange glow across the horizon, the Marines gathered together for a brief moment of rest. They had fought through the exercise, and now they could take pride in their success. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with a medal or an official recognition. It was the quiet victory of a group of Marines who had learned to work together, to lead with humility, and to rise above their individual egos. Miller stood in the distance, watching his Marines. He had given them everything he could, and now, it was up to them to continue the legacy of leadership and integrity they had learned. As the last light of day faded, the Marines sat in silence, reflecting on the lessons they had learned, knowing that their journey was far from over. But they were ready. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next. As the days turned into weeks, the Marines continued to evolve, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. They had come to understand the true meaning of leadership, the kind of leadership that didn't come from the power of a rank or the strength of a body, but from the integrity of a man's character. John Miller had taught them this lesson without ever needing to utter it aloud. He had shown them that leadership was about remaining steady when the world around you was chaos, about setting an example through your actions, and your strength of will. It was about selflessness and about putting the team before yourself. The Marines now understood the real meaning of service. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about being there for each other, about showing respect, and about being someone others could count on when it mattered most. As the camp prepared for another round of advanced training, the leadership lessons they had learned came into sharp focus once again. This time, the exercise would test not only their combat skills, but their ability to maintain composure under pressure. It was one of the toughest challenges they had faced, but there was no doubt in their minds. They had grown stronger. They had learned how to lead, how to listen, and how to adapt. The storm they had faced together, the literal and metaphorical ones, had forged them into a unified force. Corporal Jennings, once the most unsure, now moved through the camp with confidence. He had earned the respect of his peers not by forcing his leadership, but by living it, by supporting his team, by making them better. He led not with orders, but with actions, and the Marines followed. The night before the exercise, the unit gathered around a small fire, the quiet hum of the camp filling the air. The sounds of distant conversations mixed with the crackling of the flames, but the Marines were silent, their faces lit by the warm glow of the fire. There was a sense of camaraderie, a sense of shared purpose that had become the foundation of everything they did. They no longer feared the challenge ahead. They were ready for it. As Miller sat back and watched them, his expression remained as steady as ever. He had done his part. He had shown them the way. Now, it was up to them to continue the journey. He had become a symbol of what it meant to be more than just a soldier, more than just a Marine. He had taught them the importance of heart, of character, of respect for each other and the mission they shared. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to stories from the past. Old veterans shared tales of battles fought long ago, of hardships overcome, and of lessons learned in the heat of combat. But as the stories were told, it wasn't just the words that resonated. It was the quiet understanding between them all that what they had now, the respect, the bond, the shared purpose, was just as important as any battle won. It was the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured by medals or awards. It was the kind of legacy that was built through shared experiences, through the understanding that each person, no matter their background or their history, had something valuable to offer. The next morning, as the Marines lined up for the exercise, they did so with a quiet confidence. They weren't just soldiers going through the motions. They were a team, a unit, each one of them relying on the others, knowing that they were all in this together. They moved with purpose, with the discipline they had earned, with the strength they had learned from each other. And when the exercise began, they faced it not with fear, but with the kind of calm strength that had been instilled in them by Miller. They worked together seamlessly, their movements coordinated, their communication clear. It wasn't the fastest or the most aggressive tactics that won the day. It was their ability to stay focused, to trust one another, and to stay true to the lessons they had learned. The exercise ended, and the Marines stood in formation, sweat on their brows, exhaustion in their bodies, but pride in their hearts. They had passed the test. They had done it together, as a team. Captain Davis, who had been observing from the sidelines, walked up to them with a nod of approval. "Well done, all of you," he said, his voice full of respect. "This was a hard exercise, and you handled it better than I expected. You didn't just follow orders. You led. You supported each other. And you got through it." Miller, standing off to the side, watched with a quiet smile. He didn't need to say anything. The Marines had already shown him everything he needed to see. They had become the kind of soldiers he had always hoped they would be, strong, disciplined, and above all, unified. As the camp settled back into its rhythm, the Marines continued their training, but they were no longer just learning skills and tactics. They were learning what it truly meant to be part of something bigger than themselves. They had learned that the greatest strength didn't come from what you could do alone, but from what you could achieve together. And as they moved forward, they carried that lesson with them, a lesson passed down from one quiet man who had shown them what it meant to lead, not by force, but by example.